Well, thank you for the invitation. I wish I could be in Milan right now talking to you in person, maybe meeting in a cafe later on to argue about this presentation, but instead I'm in my home office, bunkered down, trying to avoid my fellow Americans as we continue to botch our response to this pandemic. But the pandemic's not all bad. I didn't have to endure a long flight. I didn't even have to put on pants, although I assure you that I did. I'm fine. But many of my fellow citizens are not. And that's really what this talk is about. We're in the middle of an apocalypse, like you might read about in science fiction. Science fiction writers like to write about parallel realities in which people lead parallel lives that don't touch. But we find ourselves in perpendicular realities, realities that are racing away from each other at right angles. And to understand these perpendicular realities, we won't start in December 2019, when we first became aware of COVID-19. Instead, we're going to start 40 years ago with Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave. In 1980, Toffler envisioned a near future in which people could work white-collar jobs out of their own homes. His vision was ideal, idyllic, generating more solid ties and more solidarity, especially domestically. He imagined couples sharing jobs. He imagined people putting together cottage industries so they could work out of their own homes. But for most of us, this was a fantasy. We kept driving to work. We kept coexisting with other workers and offices. People did try to work from home, and many of them hated it. And that's why we saw co-working explode in the late 2000s. You may have heard about it. But many of us still physically gathered in our traditional workplaces. And then once COVID struck, we had to stay home or work dangerously or not work at all. Now, for my home city, Austin, a large percentage of people could work safely at home. Partly that's because Austin is well positioned for post-bureaucratic work. For instance, non-employer firms, firms with no employees, independents, or small partnerships grew 64% from 2002 to 2008. These firms were made of graphic designers or search engine optimization specialists or independent contractors, and they could now assemble networks of subcontractors to do the work that was once done by a more established firm. And this trend was aided by the fact that work and the world is growing ever more literate. Writing is maybe our most useful and flexible tool. It makes its way into every aspect of our lives, saturating them to a degree that it has never done before. It turns out for 98% of human history, we didn't have writing. We finally invented it in 3200 BC as a hacked together accounting system for elites. But now we have nearly universal literacy. And that means that the overwhelming majority of elementary school kids learn a basic level of reading, writing, and textual problem solving. And that's a big deal. In 1870, 20% of people at or above the age of 14 were illiterate, unable to read or write in any language. By 1979, that number in the US dropped to only 0.6%. So literacy is a big part of our toolkit. When we face a problem, we often reach for a textual solution. And we see the results in other changes of work. Just looking at statistics, again from the US, in 1800, over 40% of US jobs were agricultural. In 1870, about 60% of US jobs were manufacturing jobs. Now both of these classes of work are trending downward. And we see a spike in knowledge-based work and creative work and low-wage service work. Agriculture and manufacturing are still important, but they've been systematized to the point where they're remarkably productive without a large percentage of workers. Instead, those workers have flooded to these other two areas. High-paying jobs are concentrated in knowledge work, work that involves analyzing and transforming knowledge, work that uses those important literacy skills. Now, part of the reason knowledge work has spiked is that it has the infrastructure to do so. We're suffused with information and communication infrastructure wherever we go. And one example is mobility. Mobility has changed globally. When the offices closed due to COVID, many workers just grabbed their laptops, their iPads, and their work phones and relocated home. By 2024, our next presidential election, if we have one, there will be 8.9 billion mobile subscriptions, far more than individuals. So for many of us, COVID means moving our work home, but not for everyone. And that means that socially, COVID has split us not into parallel realities, but into perpendicular realities, not realities that live alongside each other without touching, but realities that race away from each other at right angles. And they look like this. This is the so-called K-shaped recovery, rather than a U or a V shape in which we all face pain and recover together. On the right side of the K, one line races upward, showing the rapid recovery of technology, retail, and software services. Another side races downward, showing the decline of travel, entertainment, hospitality, and food services. Here they are, the upward and downward slopes of the K. On the upward slope are knowledge work, services at a distance, and the relatively dangerous delivery services and essential services. On the downward slope are jobs that are not essential and that can't be distanced. Personal services such as haircuts, nails, yoga studios, but also travel, in-person entertainment, hospitality, and food services. Because these two realities are racing away from each other, they are largely invisible to each other. So let's explore these. First, the view from the upward slope. This is, by the way, this is where I am. Yeah, on the upward slope, home offices either exist or we hurriedly assemble them. I'm currently broadcasting out of my bedroom. That's my office during the day. We all have broadband, we have devices, there's no commuting, so we've recovered time and fuel expenses. We work in casual clothes. My neighbor, who is in financial services, has worn basketball shorts every day since March. I've never seen him so relaxed. And we have more time with family. The families on our block are with their kids and each other every day. And since they're not spending money on fuel and restaurants, US saving rates are spiking. Even the US stock market has recovered. For the upward slope, stocks and retirement funds are performing well. Now, things aren't perfect. You can imagine the problems for fragile and troubled families who spend all of their time together. And solidarity at work is a challenge too. We can easily communicate and coordinate over distance. We've got Zoom, Discord, Slack, but collaborating, working with others towards a shared objective is more difficult. And not everyone has developed the strategies to do it well. Just a simple example, in a conventional co-located classroom, the students who sit on the front row have learned how to look interested. They look like this. And this helps the teacher's performance. But on Zoom, everyone is in the front row and they have not learned how to perform interest. They look more like they're watching Netflix. It's dispiriting. Still, all in all, things are going relatively well on the upward slope. But the downward slope is a different story altogether. Unemployment claims spiked after the March shutdown, with over 44 million Americans out of work. As you would expect, leisure and hospitality and trade were hardest hit. For leisure and hospitality, unemployment hit 39% in April. 2 in 5 people in that industry were out of work. And as always seems to happen, non-white Americans suffered at a higher rate than whites. Cases, hospitalizations, deaths. And as these two slopes race away from each other, solidarity disintegrates. They simply have different problems. On the upward slope, we struggle with loneliness and boredom, but conforming to the COVID regime makes good sense. On the downward slope, people have lost their jobs, their livelihood, their houses. The ones who have jobs must risk their health to work those jobs, and conforming to the COVID regimen makes terrible sense. When bars and restaurants close, those people can't work. According to one article quoted right here, our Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said, "The pandemic has accelerated existing trends in the economy and society, including the increasing use of technology, telework, and automation. This will have lasting effects on how people live and work. So how did we get here? Even before Toffler wrote about the electronic cottage in 1980, we saw the beginnings of 4 specific changes in labor. Changes to labor's object, division, organization, and location. And we'll take these in order. First, the object of labor. Increasingly, for some of us, the object of our labor is now representations, words and numbers that represent something else. As I mentioned, when you have a highly literate population, when they see a problem, they reach for a textual solution, a representation. And those representations are now much easier to circulate than they used to be because of the explosion of information and communication technologies. We have thousands of ways to quickly and cheaply share them and, importantly, to combine them. As we saw earlier, in 1800, over 40% of the US labor force was focused on agricultural work, crops and livestock. Now it's under 1%. This amazes me every time I say it. Fewer than 1% of us feed the rest of us. By 1860, over 60% of the workforce was in manufacturing. Now it's just over 20%. The majority of the labor force is either in service work, barbers, restaurant staff, cashiers, or knowledge work, transforming and processing representations. And because we have over 99% literacy, because information communication technologies have expanded radically, the cost of sharing information has dropped and work has become more easily textualized. This means more labor is focused on representations, which are progressively transformed by intersecting fields and disciplines. And that means they are emergent. They are something that can't be contained within one person's knowledge base or one person's discipline. The value of these representations comes from transforming them across different areas of expertise by temporarily combining disparate specialties to create new, unique solutions. Okay, here's where we find the upward slope. For many jobs, these representations can circulate anywhere as long as the worker has the correct information communication technologies, broadband internet, and a place of work. Workers were already set up for mutual adjustment and could substitute technologies such as video conferencing for in-person duties. Great. But on the downward slope, workers had to deal, at least in part, with things or personal services, both of which required co-location. The second change is the division of labor. Since work is increasingly textualized, increasingly about representations, these representations are often more tractable to algorithmic approaches. That means that some work could be made generic, algorithmic, offloadable, de-skilled. It could be given to non-humans, such as machines, or lower skilled humans, such as interns. Other work is self-programmable labor, addressable only by a trained or professionalized human being. These distinctions are made, of course, by Manuel Castells. And here's a quick comparison between the two types of labor. Generic is low-skilled, self-programmable is multi-skilled. Automated or low-cost versus done by specialists, focusing on tasks versus a goal and generating your own tasks, routine and repetitive versus problem solving, creating knowledge. And I won't read the rest to you. I'll just add terminal learning versus lifelong learning. Two very different modes of work. And importantly, these two types of labor are not strictly bounded and separated. This is a study I did of search engine optimization about 10 years ago. SEO specialists face an ever-changing landscape requiring them to constantly innovate, to deal with self-programmable labor. To deal with this constant innovation, they would develop routines that they could either automate or outsource to interns, creating generic labor. And this opened up time to address new challenges. That is, today's self-programmable labor becomes tomorrow's generic labor, so the specialists can take on new, unique challenges. And we've seen this trend across the landscape of knowledge work. Over the past 50 years, organizations have outsourced non-core functions as well as automating routine labor. Now, one example is that of online labor markets such as Upwork, which outsource both macro tasks, that is to say self-programmable labor, outsourcing for expertise, and micro tasks, generic labor, outsourcing for capacity. I want to draw your attention to the paper in the lower left corner, where Laura Sapanen and colleagues examined how online labor markets interact with Nordic working life. Now, so on the upward slope, workers whose jobs were self-programmable tended to work from home. Necessary workers who had generic skills kept their jobs, but had to be co-located, and they were in danger. Healthcare workers and teachers fit both categories. On the downward slope, workers whose jobs were both generic and unnecessary lost their jobs. Number 3, the way labor is organized. Labor that has become increasingly representational and increasingly self-programmable has been organized differently. Barley and Kunda in 2001 termed this type of labor organization post-bureaucratic, although we could use other terms such as networked and ad hoc-cratic. Think about those organizations that have shed non-core functions over the past 50 years. And the sole proprietorships and small businesses that have been enabled by ICTs, information communication technologies, and generic labor. More work happens across bureaucracies, organizations, hierarchies, and disciplines. And this partly means that work is projectified, that is to say, organized around a project, not a department or a specialty. So leadership rotates through the life of the project with different specialists driving the project at different times. When the project is done, the assemblage disperses. This change in organization means that a given specialist might be working on different projects with different teams at the same time. As Jure Engström argues, labor is no longer mainly in reasonably well-bounded, although interlocking and network structured units. And he says the boundaries and structures of activity systems seem to fade away. We see context collapse as a specialist might orient to several distinct projects, sometimes sharing solutions between them. Here's a diagram from a paper that David Guile at University College London and I recently wrote. Hopefully none of you are reviewing it. The circle at the top left represents how an initiating entity sees the project's object. As that entity brings in other entities with different specializations, they see the object of labor differently from within their specialties. And these objects are not equal. They cohere only loosely. The more specialists that are brought in, the more diverse their conceptions and enactments of the object will be. For instance, imagine a technology innovator who wants to become an entrepreneur, commercializing her technology. To make this happen, she needs to find an unsolved problem that the innovation will solve for a specific market. That means she has to seek people with expertise in that market, in marketing, in funding, in technical aspects. She also might have to pivot several times, finding different problems to solve and continually dropping some specialists and adding others before she can find a market fit. After several cycles, with several specialists rotating in and out, the project is completed. And hopefully the object coheres enough to endure as this team of specialists disperses. Now, that doesn't mean that bureaucratic work is going to disappear. Post-bureaucratic work is built on the foundations of bureaucracies. For instance, you don't want a temporary heterogeneous coalition guaranteeing the quality of your water supply, or your legal system, or your election system. So on the upward slope, we see a lot of post-bureaucratic work, specialists working on projects, as well as necessary bureaucratic work, such as utilities and the food supply chain. On the downward slope, we see work that isn't considered necessary. Now, finally, this brings us to labor's location. Because much labor is representational, and because representations can circulate cheaply due to information communication technologies, much labor is distributed globally. One example we saw earlier was online labor markets. At the same time, the results of the labor have to be localized to work within a specific location. Huatang Sun has a great book out this year, 2020, in which she talks about how this tension, glocalization, affects social media design. Another case of this tension in labor's location, of course, is that of co-working spaces, shared working environments in which independent knowledge workers, such as freelancers, gather to create knowledge and benefit from it, working alone together. Co-working spaces are quite flexible. They adhere to principles of community and collaboration, although as Zlatko Bodrozic, Giuseppe Scarati, Silvia Ivaldi, and I have argued, these terms are quite underdefined. Almost anything seems to be able to fit under community and collaboration. Alessandro Gandini argues strongly that co-working spaces are occupied by both precarious workers and new entrepreneurs. He says, quote, contradictorily coexisting with different attitudes in the same relational milieu, unquote. That is, even though co-working is about community, co-workers may be living in perpendicular realities as well, having trouble finding common ground on which to build solidarity. As the burgeoning literature on co-working spaces argues, these spaces can function in a lot of different ways as a Schelling point, helping potential partners to find each other so they can exit the co-working space together, as psychological support for people who are learning outside of physical location, as a new managerial business model, as an innovation center, as Capdevila says, and on and on. Co-working spaces are meeting different, often contradictory needs because they're such a new phenomenon reacting to radical changes in how we work. Surprisingly, at least one business in Austin has recently switched their business model from a yoga studio, which is location-based, low-priority service work, to a co-working space, location-based, but it's higher priority, serving people who suddenly have to work outside the office. And just a quick side note, co-working spaces really took off in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, when commercial rental rates were low and people who were newly out of work sought to establish their own businesses. As the economy recovered, so did rental rates, so co-working spaces tended to become integrated with other businesses to create some stability. It's possible that we will see another co-working renaissance as the post-COVID recession drives down rental rates and as more workers become used to working away from the office. So again, we see a separation between work that's physically relocatable and work that is tied to a specific location. And COVID has thrown these four changes into sharp relief. It didn't create them. They've been in the works for a long time, but it's thrown them into sharp relief, and we're seeing the results. One result is a crisis in solidarity. And when I say solidarity, I don't mean the WHO clinical trial for COVID-19 treatments, which is called solidarity. I mean the ties that bind people together in a society, the recognizable shared interests that allow us to agree on an underlying social compact. Imagine the ties that are being stretched and broken as these perpendicular realities race away from each other. Ferdinand Tönnies speaks of solidarity in terms of Gemeinschaft, community, ties of blood, marriage and friendship, thick trust, and Gesellschaft, society, ties of different people living together, thin trust. Paul Adler and Charles Heckscher pick up this distinction. They offer a third type of community, collaborative community. Quote, a framework for trust in dynamic and diverse relationships, reconciling greater degrees of both solidarity and autonomy, unquote. And this requires swift trust. Quote, a collaborative community emerges when a collectivity engages cooperative, interdependent activity toward a common object, unquote. Now, my colleagues and I used this distinction when examining co-working spaces in the late 2010s, and we found that although the co-working community idealizes collaborative community, many leaned toward Gesellschaft, in which a dominant actor underwrote the co-working space, and lateral co-working relationships were based on institutional or transactional considerations. That is, co-working's month-to-month subscription model was simply not stable enough and place the financial risk on the co-working site's operator. To defray that risk, co-working sites tended to integrate with other related businesses, such as conventional office leasing or event spaces or entrepreneur incubators, creating a more stable but more institutional or transactional relationship. In co-working spaces and other arrangements optimized for post-bureaucratic work, we find that the object is typically emergent, tacitly defined, and defined externally. It's a collaboration with others outside the actor's specialty. And that means it's at the top right quadrant, characterized by cross-specialization projects, emerging values, and swift trust. Yet, these collaborations are built on networks that cover much ground with largely empty space. In more concrete terms, someone working out of their own home may have more solidarity with others who are kilometers or continents away than they do with people on their own street. And we see the results in the US right now. Distrust in institutions have reached a high point in the US. Many people simply either don't believe in COVID or believe that a 2% death rate is acceptable. Here we see a Trump rally just before the end of the campaign in which unmasked supporters showed their allegiance to him by crowding together. Trump had high support among white males without college degrees, and his followers tended to downplay or dismiss the severity of COVID-19, which has killed almost 300,000 Americans in just this year. Here we see a Biden drive-in event. People stay in their cars or wear masks. Biden has high support among non-whites, those with college degrees, and women. And it's as if these two constituencies live in two different worlds, two perpendicular lines, two realities racing apart at right angles, with bonds of solidarity stretched or snapped completely. And even as we come to the other side of the pandemic, it's not going to be the last. These changes that we have been seeing are baked into the cake. Whether we have a pandemic or not, we're still going to have these perpendicular lines. So the question is, how do we reintroduce solidarity? And unfortunately, I don't have an answer, just questions. So what I want to do is to leave these questions up as we begin our question and answer period. If you have workable answers, if you have an idea about what to do, please tell us. Thank you very much.